to Civic Matters. I'm your host, Chris Ward, where during every episode we promote the ideals behind democracy and take a backstage look at what's going on in the community that affects our everyday lives. So today I'm very excited to be discussing a hot topic right now is the criminalization of homelessness, and specifically we're going to be addressing the previous House Bill 1314, the right to rest. That was actually seen on April the 19th. It did not pass. However, we're going to address a little bit about what that bill covered and then how it affects our community moving forward. So first, I'd like to introduce our panel here. So thank you all for coming out today to discuss this topic. So I'm going to start down at the end. We have the co-founder of Denver Leaf Consulting, Kevin Calabari. So thank you for coming. We have from the Boulder Rights Watch, Darren O'Connor. Then we have Representative Joseph Salazar, thank you very much. And then we have School Board Council candidate Tay Anderson. I don't know why I always want to call you Jay. But so gentlemen, thank you all again for coming. I'd really quickly just love for you to just take 30 seconds, introduce yourself and how you're tied into the homeless situation here. So Tay, I'd like to start with you.
My name is Tay Anderson, and I'm a candidate for the Denver Public Schools Board of Education, and the reason why this is so important to me is because I'm also a homeless youth.
Nice and succinct, wasn't it?
There was.
I'm Representative Joe Salazar. I'm one of the co-prime sponsors, along with my fellow Doghouse Dam, Representative Javon Mountain, for the Homeless Right to Rest bill. I'm also a candidate for the Office of the Attorney General.
I'm Darren O'Connor, with Boulder Rights Watch, but I also do a lot of work in Denver. I'm a University of Denver Law School student. I had the privilege of working on Representative Salazar's Right to Rest Act language this year, and have been supporting decriminalization of homelessness for years in Denver and Boulder.
Kevin Calabari, a local business owner, co-chair the committee called the Alternative Solutions Advocacy Project, which has brought together faith-based organizations, nonprofits, businesses, members of the homeless community, service providers, to try to tackle this issue, try to fill in where our city has really, I think, left some folks behind. And we're the folks that are primarily behind the new tiny house village that's going up on 26 in Walnut. Got involved in this because the city perpetually said that businesses don't want to see homeless people downtown. And I knew that there were many, many, many independent businesses in Denver that wanted to think a little differently about this issue, and brought together a coalition of folks that were supportive of homeless policy reform in Denver.
Well, thank all of you. So what I'd like to do for our viewing audience that may not be familiar with House Bill 1314 is quickly define it. This bill was actually established basic rights for persons experiencing homelessness, including but not limited to the right to use and move freely in public spaces, to rest in public spaces, to eat or accept food in any public space where food is not prohibited, and to occupy a legally parked vehicle, and to have a reasonable expectation of privacy in one's property. The bill does not create an obligation for the provider of services for persons experiencing homelessness to provide shelter or services where and when none may be available. So really quick, really just let's give our viewing audience first as an idea of what is the population of our homeless brothers and sisters in the state of Colorado? Does anybody know like a sheer number?
I guess that number's it's really difficult to pin down. I know that in terms of homeless youth, those who are from kindergarten all the way up until 12th grade, what we have been able to track is we have about 22,000 homeless youth in the state of Colorado. Now, in terms of the entire homeless population, that's very difficult to really give an estimate to.
Okay, and then how do we already account for the homeless?
Well, it's basically an individual who is who doesn't have a primary residence already established for themselves. It could be an individual who just doesn't, who not only lives on the street, but an individual who hops from house to house. That's also considered a person who is homeless.
Okay. Would any of you be able to speak to, they said that essentially the Denver Post, I think it was just last November, had actually stated that the population of homelessness was decreasing. However, as you just mentioned, the population of homeless children was increasing. Overall numbers, can we attribute this to the legalization of cannabis in the state of Colorado?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's really unfair. I think cannabis is certainly something that's created some visibility for Colorado in the national media. It's given people a reason to pay some attention to it. But there's a lot of reasons for that. Industry in general, if you look at energy and technology, certainly booming here. Throw those together with the fact that people are all across the country looking for jobs in a higher quality of life than they can get in a lot of rural areas. They're moving to city centers, and Denver just happens to be one of those that's grabbing a lot of folks from this mountain region. But I think it was inevitable that Denver was going to grow. But a lot of the attention that it's got put on it recently, just because of the quality of life that we do experience here, has really gotten out, and I think attracted folks in general.
Absolutely.
And just to speak to the numbers going down or up year to year, the main way that we find out or estimate how many people are experiencing homelessness across the nation is something called the Point in Time Study, I believe done through the Coalition for the Homeless. And this is a process where you go out for one night in January, go to the shelters, go to places you know people might normally stay, and try to get the numbers. And it's incredibly inefficient in finding people, because people are hiding because of things like the camping ban, and so there's a lot of scatter in the data from year to year. So it's very hard to say that there's a downward trend until you see it for a long time, and even then you're talking about a subset of the population, and it will always be an undercount. Like, I think nationally we have listed from that study 500,000 people that are homeless, and some estimates are that it's more like 2 to 4 million.
And what I want to say is that when you read reports like that from the Denver Post, or when you hear statements like that from, say, the mayor of Denver, that they try to pinpoint homelessness to one particular issue, which is legalization of cannabis. That's usually an obtuse and simplified way of trying to address a very complex problem. What we know about homelessness is that an awful lot of it derives from poverty. A lot of it derives from mental health or addiction to drug use or alcoholism. There are so many factors associated with it. Also, bad policies. When you have the city and county of Denver with its growth and with the high cost of living, that's driving people into homelessness. When you have mobile home parks that provide people 10 days notice for eviction, whereas other states such as Connecticut provide over 500 days notice, that also drives homelessness. So it's not a simple answer as, well, you legalized cannabis, so therefore we have all these homeless people here. So I reject those kinds of findings from the Denver Post or anybody.
I think even if even if that was the sole reason, let's say in a perfect world it was, it really underscores, I think, the lack of services, the lack of assistance, the lack of support that people have if they are going through a rough moment in life. And Representative Salazar touched on it. We can't attack homelessness, this issue of homelessness, with one solution, because it's a very wide problem with many reasons why people are in that position. It could be as simple as losing the sole income earner in a home. It could be a devastating accident without health insurance. It could be the housing prices and the fact that they've doubled in Denver here the last couple of years for most folks. The transitions and all those things don't happen quickly, but I think it goes to show the lack of support that people have when they go through those to stay on their feet. And it's really become increasingly more difficult. I employ a lot of folks that are slightly above minimum wage and tip earners, and a lot of artists in the comedy and the visual art space, and all those people are going through a lot of difficulties right now. If it's not homelessness, it's on the verge of it. Having live workspaces be attacked in this city, we're starting to get some movement on that, but there's a lot of people that were living and working in the same spot. Our zoning code doesn't allow for these things to happen. The tiny house village that we're working on in 26 and Walnut is a pilot program, but I think a sign of how we need to consider different housing options that aren't just a one bedroom in a brand new building that costs $1,300, $1,400, $1,500 a month. There's a big gap in between homelessness and being able to afford a $1,500 a month place to live. So until we can redefine our zoning code, until we can actually start thinking outside the box about what's an appropriate standard of living for people, until we talk to people about the standard of living that they're comfortable with, which I think is something our city hasn't done, then I don't think we're going to be able to do much to fix this. It does start with housing. It does start with providing people with the basic needs, and I think most folks, if we provide that, are going to be able to get back on their feet. But we're not even getting close to touching that.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the House Bill 1314, and we're very fortunate to have one of our primary sponsors, again with you and Representative Melton, that were there. What was it that we wanted to accomplish with the Right to Rest Act?
So essentially, what we've been trying to do for the past 3 years is stop the criminalization of homelessness. We had a very broad bill starting in year 1 that we whittled down to year 2, and now we got it down to basically a bare bones minimum for year 3, which is basically, hey, look, don't criminalize the very basic human needs of having to sit down, having to rest, having to sleep, having to live in your car, right? We had a lot of exceptions in there in terms of you can't be in a public building outside of hours. You can't be in private buildings and things of that nature. I mean, we built in all these protections because we had Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry, the business groups, as well as municipalities, and an uproar over basic human rights. So we whittled it down as much as we could, and I think that's probably as far as we're willing to go, and for next year's bill. And so the essence of it is just to stop the criminalization of homelessness.
Yeah. And I think, and Kayvon, you had seen this. Kayvon was video, I think, was made international and available, was when you recorded the police officers removing tents and sleeping blankets and so on and so forth from the homeless in cold weather. Could you explain your experience whenever you got that on camera?
Yeah, these were a result of the the urban camping ban, the sweeps that they were doing. They had just started to ramp those up when it was getting cold outside at the beginning of last winter, and they were pushing folks from that downtown triangle by the Mission, and generally they would sweep it up, clean it up, and let folks go back. But this time they pushed it a little further and actually had folks stationed down there, preventing them from setting up shop again. And it's important to remember, a lot homeless people are gravitating towards these common areas and being in big groups because they're doing it for community, they're doing it for safety, they're doing it so they know they can get through the night. And when you start disbanding these groups, they have to go into places and become somebody else's burden, right? They're in smaller groups. They don't have the comfort and the safety that they would have in these larger groups. And essentially a group of homeless folks, about 15 people, were fed up with it and said, if Mayor Hancock is going to push these policies on us, we're going to take this to his doorstep. And we set up camp outside the City County building on November 30th, I think it was. And we were out there for probably 5 hours or so until the time limits, the public, the park closed essentially, I think at 10 o'clock that night. They had 12 cop cars on the other side of City County building, parked and waiting for that hand to swoop around. And then they came and spent 3 hours, no less than 12 cops, as many as 15, for 3 hours there to issue 3 citations. But in the process, taking blankets from a homeless veteran as evidence of that citation. And that's the one that I filmed, Jerry Burton, who now fortunately is housed, which is great, but he actually had a medical emergency that night and had to be taken to the VA because of some of the stress that he was dealing with in this. But showed that video. It was the first, I think, example that got online of evidence of police, really stealing from these homeless people some of the few tools they have to survive. And that affected some policy change, and for Hancock to say that they're not going to take blankets anymore, they're simply going to take pictures of them to create evidence of that citation. But that's as shallow as I think the progress on this got, based on something that people were really in an uproar about. And it was really unfortunate to see such little movement follow such a lack of compassion by Denver Police Department.
Mm-hmm. I got to say that we sat down with the mayor back in, I want to say it was March, Representative Melton and I. And he utterly denied that there was criminalization happening. So if there's no criminalization happening, why are you taking pictures to be used as evidence? It's because it's for the prosecutors. We're going to prosecute people for violating the camping bans. And then he also told us a story about where this came from that completely contradicts his earlier statements that the camping ban was as a result of Occupy Denver. A few years back, he said, no, that's not how this camping ban got started. was, as a result of Occupy Denver. But in that meeting, he told myself as well as Representative Melton very directly that it was because of Occupy Denver that they brought the camping bans. And we said, well, Occupy Denver no longer exists in the context of camping out in Civic Center Park. So why do you need it? And he would not necessarily provide us an answer to the question, so we answered it for him. You need it because this is what you're using against the homeless community. That's why you're doing it. And you're pushing the homeless community into Thornton, into Arvada, into Aurora, into Wheat Ridge, into other areas, because that's the way you're dealing with the situation. Is you're saying we're going to criminalize you, which is very similar to how municipalities dealt with African Americans and other communities of color a century ago, where they would criminalize certain behaviors in order to push them out into other communities. So we tried to note the irony of this camping ban, and I don't know if it's a disconnect in his mind, between his mind and his soul, or if the disconnect is because he has other aspects of his mind controlling his actions, such as business interests. But there's a disconnect there for Michael Hancock with respect to how treating the least of our brethren demonstrates what our moral ground is. And so, it was very disappointing sitting in that meeting. He got pretty hot with the two of us, and we were going to back down. Give a damn. He's so what if he's the mayor of Denver? We're state representatives of our own area, and so we're going to represent not only our constituents but those who are disenfranchised, and so that meeting was very interesting to us.
And if it's not the criminalization of homelessness, and I think Hancock likes to point out that maybe there have been like 4 citations written in the last 12 months in violation of the urban camping ban, does not take into consideration all the harassment that people who are homeless that sleep on the streets every night have to deal with. And when you have cops coming by and waking you up every 3 hours from the place that you are and essentially pushing you 1 block down the road so you can relive the same thing 3 hours later, that's a huge burden on your mental health. I can only imagine if I had to wake up every 3 hours, how my life would suffer, how my relationships would suffer, how my ability to have a productive life would suffer. So there's a lot of things that aren't in the stats that he likes to throw out there to say that it's not as bad as people are saying it is. The city of Denver, who was a big part, in my understanding, in getting the Right to Rest Act squashed through their lobbying individual members of the House, or having Eric Sullivan, who's the new director of the Office of Hope, go and throw out some of these stats that are just truly misleading and don't really shine light on the gravity of the issue that we're dealing with right now.
All right. And what options are there? So, Tay, you had mentioned that you were homeless youth previously. What other options, if we don't have a safe place to stay, what are other options for Denverites or people residing in Colorado or in Denver in particular, to where can they stay, where can they sleep?
I think that there is no other option at times, because it's one thing to be a homeless youth, because I'm currently a homeless youth. So it's one thing to be a homeless youth because people will outpour their support for a young person to say, we have to get you off the streets. But if I'm 21 years old and I'm homeless, nobody cares. They'll walk past me and they'll say, oh, okay, just another one. And I think that the city and county of Denver doesn't understand is that we can't just continue to push them out. As Representative Salazar was saying, we can't just continue to push them out to other cities and say, now it's your burden. Because if they came to Denver for a reason, they came because they feel like they can sleep in these areas, they can rest in these areas, and we shouldn't have to criminalize them and put them to jail or give them citations or tickets because they just want to rest. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, it comes back to the alternatives that you have when the city and county of Denver doesn't offer an alternative. When majority of our shelters are already filled, where we could be building more shelters or tiny home villages in some of the neighborhoods that aren't already built up, but we're continuing to build more lofts and then charge $1,300 just to live in a 1-bedroom studio. Or we're going to then tear down an area and we're going to build a new supermarket. but we're not putting the citizens in, and they are citizens. We're not putting their rights first. We're putting money and we're putting politics before humans, and I don't think that's right.
No, absolutely. Now, 10 hours. I think I was there in the Capitol building when Representative Melton read the Right to Rest Act, and you cited who would be, what parties would benefit from allowing this to fail. Like, who would have been the forces? You said that people were lobbying individuals to make sure that this does not pass. Who would lobby for this to fail?
I mean, if I could be a conspiracy theorist for a second,
Absolutely.
Seeing what I've seen in the cannabis industry with a lot of zoning getting pulled out from under businesses, seeing the DIY artists get kicked out of their spaces last fall, seeing what we have going on with the I-70 expansion, which is very much unsupported by pretty much everybody outside of our some members of our state and city government, the Great Western Stock Show expansion. I mean, what's driving all of these things is development. Mm-hmm. And any time that you impede, I think, the progress of development, we see the city and we see the state really step up and defend the right to develop, the right to continue this economic expansion that we're seeing in the city. And while economic expansion is generally a pretty good thing, and we like to see it, it can't be at the detriment of the people that really have made Denver the great place that it is. You know, people wouldn't be moving here so much if it weren't for the communities and the culture that we've developed here over the last few decades. And to really just piss on that, frankly, because we want to continue to see this growth and continuing to attract new businesses here, I think it's a very shallow way and not a very sustainable way of looking at things. But I think if you look at the folks that put some of our staunchest proponents of suppressing homeless policies, the proponents of criminalizing homelessness are folks that were often put in office by development dollars. And there's a clear path there. There's lines to be drawn. So I'm actually working on a larger story that I think the current governor's office and our current mayor's office isn't going to be too happy with when it's done. That does tie a lot of these things together. Does connect some of these dots, and hopefully it'll expose some of these things that I think everybody knows out there, but we don't have a lot of media supporting outside of maybe the Westward. They've been the only media outlet in this city to actually speak the truth about what our state and city governments are doing to our homeless population. The Denver Post, they don't cover it nearly as much, and that's about all we have. We can't expect anything from our local news outlets, obviously, when it comes to network television and things of that nature.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if I could weigh in,
Please.
One of the folks who were lobbying against this was the Colorado Municipal League, and so they're basically a coalition that represents the different cities, and there's the argument is made by them and their members that this should be a local issue, that it should be dealt with uniquely to each area, so we shouldn't be putting legislation on top of folks to tell them how to handle this. But so it is a statewide issue, and we were talking about pushing people out of Denver. And I'm in Boulder, where I hear the city council talk all the time about how people are sent to our city because we have the best services, and Denver will claim they have all the services that people need. They always have a bed, and everyone points fingers and says the other city is sending people out, and yet Boulder has just recently embraced the idea of doing what they call a reunification program, Chris, which is giving people a one-way ticket out of town, as if that's a compassionate response to homelessness. And the city of Boulder was opposed to this because ultimately, I think folks here have mentioned it, that these laws give the police a tool, really, a right to approach people who they think are homeless and they don't want to be in a space. And it gives them a right to approach them and run their identification if they have it, because about 50% from our polling that Denver Homeless Out Loud did, about 50% of people have had their belongings taken by the police and never got them back, and so they end up losing their identification. There's just a whole host of problems that comes once the police are able to approach you, and these laws give them a reason to do so. And so the right to rest would have, not only allowed people to sleep, which is a tremendous need. I slept out recently just to experience it and see what was going on. And when I was done, I got on my bike and went home and went to bed. I was exhausted just from one night, but beyond that, this law, the Right to Rest Act, would give people the peace of knowing that the police, have to really see them doing something wrong besides just resting to come harass them.
To expand on the municipal league piece, I think it was last year in 2016 session, Representative Singer wanted to amend the right to rest to allow for municipalities to opt out if they're providing adequate housing and services. And it's like, how do you define that, right? If you rely on the city of Denver and what Mayor Hancock's saying, he says that we do have adequate services here, then why, when we hit below zero in our temperatures, do we have to open up overflow space for 150 people, and why do we have to ship another 200 outside of the county to make sure that they're in a place warm? That means that we don't have adequate services. And even if we did have enough shelter space, there's a lot of reasons why people can't go in those shelters. And this is starting to come out, I think, and it's educating. The Denver Homeless Out Loud is doing a great job of this, educating on why these shelters are not appropriate for all people. But there's a lot of misinformation that these municipalities are feeding, I think, that could have gotten them out of this Right to Rest Act in last year's session, and that's one of the reasons it died, is that's just unacceptable. You can't opt out of human rights, basic human rights.
They were asked by, I think, the chair of the committee during deliberations, what would you change about this bill to make it acceptable? And they said, well, we don't know. We didn't come prepared to talk about solutions, really. I mean, that's not the words they used, obviously, but that's the reality.
Yeah, they never come with solutions. We delayed on the hearing this year for the Right to Rest Act bill to try to get them to come to the table to give solutions. And they never wanted to provide any solutions. City and county, our city of Boulder didn't want to provide any solutions. City of Denver didn't want to provide solutions, neither did city of Fort Collins, and it just led us to believe that they want to have their own little fiefdoms under the umbrella of local control. And I don't mind local control, I don't, but local control doesn't mean that you get to violate people's human rights. Right. Once you start doing that, it becomes statewide interest, and then that's when we have to step in. And that's exactly what we explained these past 3 years, is that, let's take local control and let's push it to the side, because you are violating people's constitutional civil rights. You are operating as though you are fiefdoms, and you are not. You still are under the umbrella of the state of Colorado, and we're just not going to allow you to push people out into other areas affecting those cities because you think that that's the right way of handling the issue of homelessness and with the lack of compassion. So you asked the question about what entities would come and lobby against the bill. It was Colorado Municipal League. It was the city of Boulder. It was city and county of Denver. It was city of Fort Collins. Even the city of Aurora, where Javon is at, Representative Melton, they sent in a letter. I will say that the Colorado Association of Commerce and Industry sat this one out, but that doesn't mean that they weren't operating behind the scenes. So yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of entities still fighting against the bill. Okay.
And you mentioned next year's bill. And when I was in the room, they had cited reasons why they thought that the bill wouldn't work was because it removed the power from law enforcement in the areas of if the homeless person is a direct threat to public safety, if they are in the middle of committing an illegal act such as doing drugs, or if what was the other one?
Impeding the right-of-way?
Impeding right-of-way. If they were covering too much of the sidewalk and people were having to walk out into oncoming traffic to clear around the homeless people. So are these things that are going to be included in the future bill so that we can address these, or do you think that those were just smoke screens for how they could oppose it?
It was all a red herring, all of that. Right now, if the police see someone engaging in an illegal activity, they can arrest them. That bill didn't change anything. Right? We had a provision in there about you cannot impede right-of-ways. Right. We already had that in there. And law enforcement is famous for. In fact, they're some of the biggest drama queens at the legislature. They are just absolutely famous of saying, oh my God, you're taking everything away from us, and now we just can't arrest anybody now, right? And that's exactly how they acted in this particular situation. And I really wish that they would stop dramatizing a very human tragedy that's occurring here in the state of Colorado, and let's actually put our minds together about how can we best to do this in a compassionate way. You know, then of course when you bring up the issue of, well, let's talk about how law enforcement responds to the homeless. You take their blankets away from them when it's 5 degrees outside. Was that the right thing to do, right? And then they sit there and they defend themselves over it, right? Mm-hmm. So they actually don't know what side of their bread is buttered on, mm-hmm. And they just like to make up stuff as they move along the way.
I think that the city and county of Denver is also over dramatic as well, with saying we have this homeless epidemic and they're just taking over, when in reality you walk through Civic Center Park and there are probably about, I go through there almost every Saturday, and there's probably like 30 people, mm-hmm. and they're not in the way. They are not in the way. You really can't see them unless you're looking for them, and they're not bothering anybody. They want to be able to rest. They want to be able to be peaceful without being interrupted. And I think that it's not fair for the mayor and the city to exempt rules for when it comes to a social justice issue, and we say, oh, you can stay here for X amount of time, but then when it comes to the homeless issue, it's you're out by the time park hours are over, or we're going to arrest you. And we shouldn't have to, our citizens shouldn't have to live in fear of if they're going to get arrested because they can't afford a place to live in. The city that has basically told them you can't live here if you can't afford to live here at all, and we've seen rent, especially in the east side, just go to skyrocket through the roof, and then we're telling them to go find places to live. But you have the I-70 expansion, which is going to take some houses away. You have like I said, the east side, where the gentrification in our areas, where making rent almost inaccessible to pay. And then also you're telling them to find other places to live, but almost everybody else is gentrifying too, and so it's almost impossible that if you don't make $2,000 a month, you can't live in Colorado, basically, because almost everywhere you go, $1,300, $1,000 for a one-bedroom apartment, but then you still have all your other necessities to get through the month. And if you're only making $2,000 a month, then you're really not making that much money. You're at poverty. And then if you can't make that money, then we kick you. Then your landlord kicks you out, and then you're on the streets. Then you go to jail for being homeless. And I think that we have to hold the city and county of Denver accountable as well, and tell them that they just need to stop being dramatic, because they had 2 Democratic representatives that failed that community, and that failed the Representative Salazar and Representative Melton, where they basically pumped up their head and was like, yeah, we got this all the way until you get there. And then they're just like, wait, we're not going to have your back. Mm-hmm. And I think that Representative Rosenthal and Representative Gray, they were totally wrong for that. And they should be held accountable for their actions come next session when this bill is reintroduced.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of hope for next year. You know, mm-hmm. If it's not what Representative Salazar and Melton were able to do with growing the coalition this year, Rep. Singer and Coleman, I believe, on the committee as well, are both very much in favor of finding some solutions here. Our ASAP groups met with now the mayor's office, all 13 members of City Council, and Chief White here in Denver. And there's a lot of City Council people that are not happy with how we're treating our homeless population. A lot of new City Council people. When I look down the line, people that I might not have expected, Councilwoman Sussman and Black, Rafael Espinoza, Wayne New, Paul Lopez. There's Robin Kinich is a big affordable housing proponent. There are a lot of people that we thought we actually had 7 votes in City Council earlier to repeal the urban camping ban. But when we met with Mayor Hancock and said, if we have 7 and if they vote on it and if they pass this, we don't have 9, I don't think, for a supermajority to withstand your veto, will you veto this? And he said flat out, yes. And we asked him why that was, and brought up a lot of the same Occupy arguments and things like that. And we said, okay, let's take that off the table for a second. What will you do to provide some basic right basic necessities for people, survival needs, we call them, to live on the streets. He complains about human feces everywhere. Well, why don't we have public toilets open? Complain about trash everywhere. Why is there one trash can for every 3 blocks where these homeless populations exist? You complain about needles everywhere. Why aren't there more Sharps boxes? You know, there's like very simple things that we could be doing that are probably going to save money for the city, that are going to take away a lot of the eyesore that they complain about. That would end up costing less at the end of the day and make this burden less of a burden across the board, both with regard to aesthetics and with regard to the real problem that he doesn't want to even listen to this. He didn't want to even walk down that road. And things like the tiny house village, things like these 10 storage containers that they just approved and put out the other day. I mean, you know, I'm happy that they're doing that, but when you have thousands and thousands of homeless people and you're talking about 10 storage units and 11 tiny homes, give me a break. That doesn't put a dent in it. And the city's liking to take right now a lot of credit for these things that are aesthetically pleasing, that are great stories that they can boast in the news, but actually aren't doing a goddamn thing to affect change here.
Excellent. Well, what can the community do? So I think I'd spoke to Darren before the show, and I said that it's very difficult to wait on government to enact anything. So as citizens of Colorado, what can you name a resource that we can go to so we can follow along with what's going on, or is there an action that we could take to help support our homeless brothers and sisters? So, Kayvon, I'm going to go back to you.
I mean, our ASAP group, Alternative Solutions Advocacy Project, movealongtowhere.com. We have petitions on where nonprofits, businesses, residents, faith-based organizations can sign on in support of homeless policy reform. Obviously, Denver Homeless Out Loud. These 2 organizations are very much accepting money. The Village Collaborative that is creating the tiny house village and constructing this, we're fully funded now, but this is the first of hopefully 50 tiny house villages that we're going to push. We're actually going to be presenting to the Housing Committee in the City and County of Denver here very shortly to lay this plan out, to say that we can fund it privately. Now we need you to take what we're doing there with which is urban land conservancy land that's not going to be used for affordable housing for 4 or 5 years, using that as this transitional housing for tiny homes. That's a program we want to grow, and unless we can, 1, make this first one successful, and 2, find the means and the resources to build additional ones, I don't know that that's ever going to take off. But if it is a success, we need to put pressure on our city to make it one that can be long-term and sustainable. So the Colorado Village Collaborative, Denver Homeless Out Loud, and Alternative Solutions Advocacy Project, at least as far as the efforts that I'm engaged in, I think in the City and County of Denver is the best way to get involved. But I think the state stuff is probably a little different, and let these guys speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, DenverHomelessOutloud.org is a good site, and every year as we build up towards running this bill, and it warms my heart that Representative Salazar is talking about next year. I'm not surprised, but it's nice to hear that. You can get involved there. That organization, we do, I think, an excellent job of engaging with people who want to help. And the other piece on, that waiting for government is an exercise in futility. That is often true, but I'm watching right now in Boulder where they just had what I called the so-called homeless working group, where they hired an outside corporation for supportive housing to come in and basically document what they want to do, and called it a collaboration. As a result of that, they shut down a bunch of services, and the faith community really woke up because they were so engaged in helping people who are homeless find emergency shelter through their congregations. And as a result, it was like kicking a beehive, and the faith community really rallied and started communicating with the city council that this is not okay. And it's amazing to see how fast government can jump when they have enough people paying attention and caring. So I haven't given up on government taking action, but I know that waiting for that to happen, you can begin to have gray hairs doing that.
Representative Salazar.
Or you could end up losing your hair altogether. I don't know if everybody remembers, but I had a full head of hair when I started in the house. I'm joking. Right. Nothing is quite as infuriating as working a bill for months and months, and now we're talking about years, getting it close to getting it out of committee, and then having your colleagues flip on you, right? nothing is quite as infuriating as that. There's a political reason for bringing it next year, as well as the civil rights and the human issue surrounding the bill. But there's a political reason for bringing it as well, which is we're entering into an election cycle. And it's the faith-based community, it's the ACLU, the civil liberties groups, it's the homeless population, it's so many of the groups that partnered with us throughout these 3 years that can sit down with each of the representatives and say, this election cycle is coming up and we're going to hold you accountable, because we don't need any more immoral or those who are deficient in their morality. We don't need any more elected officials like you. And we're going to hold you accountable. And if that means running primaries on people, if that means unelecting them, then that's what needs to happen. And people need to be serious about that. They need to stop talking about, well, I'm going to not vote for that person. It really needs to come down to action. That not only not voting for the person, but finding a moral alternative, someone who is willing to stand up for the rights of a human being. So that's why we're going to run it again next year, and we will run it again. And I'm hopeful that Representative Melton will run it after I leave the House. But that's why we need to continue running it, because as I've said before, when you're on the right side of history, you'll always be right.
And I think that one of the ways that you can get involved with the young people is, Representative Salazar was saying, is we will unelect a school board member this November because they are not operating in the best interest of our students, especially our homeless students. And so one way that I would love for the audience to continue to engage is by going to www.tayanderson.org and engaging in that conversation with us, and come up with a plan to how do we make sure that all of our homeless students are being able to have the accessibility to all. That means housing, that means food, if that means how do we get representation for all of them. And so that's what I'm going to continue to fight for once I get onto the school board. And in November, we will unelect a school board member so that we can impact and start that change that we want to see.
Excellent. Last question is really, I'd love to hear why people are passionate about a particular subject. And I think being homeless youth is probably the passion for it, but what drives you on this particular issue to help out, besides being homeless youth yourself, but others in your situation?
Just because I always wanted to be a voice to the voiceless. My grandmother was an educator for over 35 years, and my family has countless of almost over 100 years of education experience in their background, and they continue to help change the narrative for young people around this entire nation. And so I want to continue the legacy of my family and continue to improve the lives of others, and never let their story or the narrative that is told about them hinder them from the success they want to get to. Because if I cared about who liked me and who didn't like me, and who was going to help and who didn't want to help, I wouldn't be the youngest candidate running for the Denver School Board. And that's what makes my story so impactful, is that I have to learn how to, and other young people have to learn that being popular, that's fun, but we have to make sure that we get our education, and we have to make sure that we're ready to step out into the real world. Because once we're 18, if we do have a parent, the burden of being 18 or the burden of being a parent is kind of relieved once you're 18, because you're going off to the real world and you're getting ready to start your future. And so I want to make sure every young person knows that they have a voice and they matter.
Thank you very much. That was very nice. Representative Salazar.
For myself, and it hasn't changed in all these years that I've been in elected office, and even prior to, is that for me it's about the human being. It's what it's always been about, and that comes from my background, my upbringing. My grandfather was a minister, and he talked about compassion for the human being, and that's how I basically have operated. When business interests be damned, profits be damned, you have to take care of the human being first, because that then develops the moral consciousness of your society, right? How do we treat those who are impoverished, those who are hurting? What do we do? Should we just push them aside, or do we really reach out to them as brothers and sisters? And that's how you identified the homeless population at the very beginning, as our homeless brothers and sisters. And that's how I see them. And so, as I continue moving forward, running for the office of the Attorney General, I'm keeping all options on the table for myself once I become the Attorney General about suing cities and counties and those municipalities that feel that they're going to violate human rights of those who are impoverished. I've said that very clearly. I know that business interests are all against me. I know that municipal league is all against me, and I really don't care because this is about the human being. And they can remain in their immoral stance all they want. That office is a very powerful position, and right now it's been co-opted by special interests, by oil and gas, by business interests, by everything that is a non-human entity. Mm-hmm. And so what my campaign is about the human being first. And so that's what drives me. My grandfather told me one time he gave some money to this homeless man, and I asked him, I said, Grandpa, I said, why did you do that? He says, because you never know when that person really is an angel, right? And actually, I think every single one is an angel, right? But that's what he said, is that, you never know when that person could be an angel. And you have to show compassion to your fellow human beings. And so that's how I operate. And I think that's how I've always operated as an elected official. And I've gotten a lot of flack for it. I've had some really powerful interests come after me. They almost took me out in 2014, but we prevailed, and in 2016 really took them out to the woodshed. And that's what I'm hoping to do in 2018.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. O'Connor.
Yeah, I'm hoping you do that as well. I'm looking forward to working on that. Following a lot on what Joe said, I had the opportunity to learn a little bit about what it is to be homeless, volunteering at Boulder Outreach for Homeless Overflow in the churches, which my main task, aside from helping set up and clean up, was to meet people and get to know them and let them know that they were valued. And my biases became so obvious so quickly in that I was shocked how many people were there after a bicycle accident or a skateboarding accident, or they had some debilitating disease that they were recovering from, and here they are sleeping on a mat in our churches. So these are people who are my neighbors. Whether they're housed or not, they're my neighbors. And I just want to share that my father passed away not that long ago, and some of the most touching moments I had was walking down the street of Boulder and having people that I know from the homeless community of Boulder walk up to me because I'd be sharing something on Facebook about that experience, and they'd come up to me and give me a hug, and despite everything they were going through, it was important to them to come to me and let me know that they cared and they were thinking about me and praying for me, and it was truly moving. And no more am I shocked because they're my neighbors, and that's why I do this work.
Well, thank you. Mr. Cullerbody.
I think my kind of thoughts on this overall as I'm learning more about how life works and how society and government works is based in what I've learned in my 13 years of drug policy reform. And when you look at homelessness and you look at drugs, those are two things that we criminalize in a huge way in this country. But both of them are public health issues. They're things that if we approach them with reasonability and compassion, we're often going to spend less in fixing those problems and probably have a better success rate at doing so. You can look at something as simple as subsidized housing being 1/3 the cost of incarcerating someone. Providing basic mental health services, basic needs that people need is far less expensive than putting them through the criminal justice system. So, we're looking at law enforcement assisted diversion, which I'm working on right now. I sit on the board of directors for the Harm Reduction Action Center that touches both of these topics in a big way. And there's just a better way to think about things. Even if you're not and I'm an independent, even if you're not a liberal, that has kind of social concerns and a baseline of humanity in every decision you make. If you're a fiscal conservative, you should be on board with these types of solutions, because we are talking about smaller government when you can empower people to create their own destiny and their own success. And you can't do that if you're perpetually criminalizing things that are public health issues. So it's hard. Like Darren, I've spent time on the streets myself, sleeping with folks at Denver Homeless Out Loud downtown, and just to, I think, build trust more than anything. Not even to see what it was like, but to build trust. I knew that if I was going to be working with these folks, they are so distrustful for good reason, that there needs to be that developed, and I think that really helped. But once you get to know these folks, it's almost impossible not to want to do something. and to be further empowered by the coalition that we have of just a wide array of people. When I go back to faith in business and nonprofits, and people are excited about helping on this topic. And when you talk about how can people help, it may not be through monetary donating. It could be through a little bit of time. It could be through calling a city council person or the mayor or these the members of the House and Senate that we're having difficulty with in gaining progress in the Right to Rest Act. You get to see the efforts that so many people are putting in selflessly on this topic, and it really is hard not to want to get involved. So I think that's why I get involved, and one of the reasons that I did want to run for mayor in Denver in 2019 was not only this issue, but a lot of the others that I think Hancock and that administration are handling very poorly. They need some pressure on that topic. He ran essentially unopposed last time around. And to be in a city this big, that's growing this quickly, that's changing so much, that has so many people that feel disenfranchised, to run unopposed and not be able to answer the questions about why you're making these poor decisions that are affecting people negatively is unacceptable. And I really look forward to challenging those thoughts. And you mentioned you maybe not have the business community in support of you. I've got at least 150 businesses that'll certainly be in support of you, and I'm going to keep growing that, because that's going to be a huge component, I think, of future elections, is these independent business owners outside of the Chamber of Commerce, outside of the Downtown Denver Partnership, that really care about aesthetics and perpetual development more than anything else. For these independent business owners to step up and say, now we're a voice too, and probably can be more impactful if we find some level of talking in unison and understanding what we're fighting for.
Well, excellent.
Cool.
That was it, mic drop. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming out, and I appreciate
Chris.
you all answering the call on the homeless situation in the state of Colorado. So this has been another episode of Civic Matters. I appreciate the viewing audience. Please, I would love for your support in 3 of our individuals that are running for publicly elected office, as well as head to the websites that we addressed that we'll put up on the screen here for you to follow along as we address this situation. So as always, it is my pleasure to serve you. My name is Chris Ward, and this has been another episode of Civic Matters. Thank you very much.